1674. Holland is drowning, not by accident, by design. You know the Spanish tercios, pike squares that crushed Europe, veterans of Mediterranean campaigns, the most feared infantry on the continent. They've ringed a Dutch city called Leiden with 62 forts. Inside, 15,000 people are eating dogs, cats, rats. 6,000 are already dead from plague and starvation. The Spanish commander, Francisco de Valdez, figures he can wait. Let hunger do the work. But William of Orange, the Dutch rebel leader, has a plan so desperate it sounds insane. Cut the dikes. Flood half of Holland. Turn fields into an inland sea. Sail a relief fleet straight through farmland to break the siege. The cost? Drowning the richest agricultural land in Europe. The gamble? Everything. Because if this fails, the whole Dutch revolt collapses and Spain rules the Low Countries for another century. This is the story of how 2,500 sailors in flat-bottomed boats turned water into a weapon. How 15 miles of flooded polder saved a revolution. How the Spanish army, which never lost a siege through direct assault, fled in the middle of the night from rising tides. No grand cavalry charge, no climactic sword fight, just water, wind, and the kind of calculation that trades your own prosperity for survival. Let's see how it happened. If you value documented siege warfare and unconventional military tactics like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Also, this script is researched and factual, using sources from the Siege of Leiden Wikipedia entry last updated 3 weeks ago in 2025. Jonathan Israel's The Dutch Republic, published by Oxford in 1995, covering Dutch military history, Diocese. And Earth Magazine's October 2016 article on the Leiden siege based on archival research from Museum de Lakenhal in Leiden. Now back to the information. 1568. The Low Countries explode. The 17 provinces that make up modern Netherlands and Belgium belong to Spain's King Philip II. He's Catholic, absolute human, and he wants uniform religion and centralized taxes. The Dutch provinces, wealthy merchant towns, Calvinist majorities in the north, centuries of local privileges, say no. Philip sends Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the Duke of Alba, with 10,000 Spanish and Italian troops. Alba's orders are clear. Crush heresy, execute rebels, restore order. He arrives in 1567 and immediately starts killing. 1572. The Spanish besiege Zutphen in November. The river Ijssel freezes solid. Alba's troops cross on ice, storm the city, massacre hundreds of the 7,500 inhabitants. Some are pushed through holes cut in the ice to drown. Others are stripped naked and sent into the winter landscape to freeze. The Dutch rebels learn fast. Spanish mercy doesn't exist. Hold or die. Haarlem falls next. 7 months of siege from December 1572 through July 1573. Inside, 3,000 rebel troops. Mixed Dutch militia, mercenaries. The Spanish artillery pounds the medieval curtain walls to rubble every day. Every night, the defenders rebuild with timber and earth. Dutch ships cross Lake Haarlemmermeer bringing food until the Spanish fleet destroys them in May 1573. After that, starvation. When Haarlem finally surrenders in July, the Spanish execute over 2,000 people as a lesson, but the siege cost Alba 6 months, massive casualties from winter cold, and proved the Dutch would resist to the end. October 1573. Alba moves on Leiden. The city sits dead center in the county of Holland, 35 miles south of Amsterdam, 12 miles inland from the North Sea coast. Population around 15,000. If Spain takes Leiden, they cut the rebel territory in half and have a clear path to Delft and The Hague. The whole revolt depends on holding this one city. Alba assigns Francisco de Valdez to lead the siege. Valdez is a veteran commander, started as a peasant, fought for Emperor Charles V in 1546 against German Protestants, led the expedition against Tunis in 1550, came to the Netherlands with Alba in 1567. He's competent, methodical, brutal, but Leiden isn't easy. The city had warning. The council stockpiled grain, salted fish, cheese. The defense works are strong. The soil is waterlogged peat, too soft to dig proper siege trenches. Valdez surrounds the city, cuts the roads, settles in. Inside, the garrison includes English, Scottish, and French Huguenot mercenaries mixed with Dutch militia. William of Orange, who's coordinating the rebel response from outside, knows Leiden must hold. He also knows he can't beat the Spanish tercios in open battle. His army totals maybe 15,000. Poorly trained militia against Spain's professional soldiers. He needs another way. April 1574. The siege lifts temporarily. William's brother Louis de Nassau invades from Germany with a relief army. Valdez has to pull troops to respond. But Spanish commander Sancho d'Avila intercepts Louis at Muckerheide on April 14th. The battle is a slaughter. Louis is killed. Most of his army is destroyed. The Spanish lose maybe 30 men. The Dutch lose thousands. It's a disaster. William had counseled the citizens of Leiden during the brief respite in April to restock food, bring in more troops, prepare for a long siege. They ignored him, figured the threat was over. May 26th, 1574. Valdez returns to Leiden with his full force. This time he builds 62 fortified positions ringing the city. Every road blocked, every canal watched. No supply getting through. Inside, the citizens realize they made a fatal mistake. Food stores are already low. By July, they're eating anything that moves. Dogs, cats, rats. Grass soup. Leather boiled for protein. The plague hits in August. Bodies pile in the streets. Of the city's 15,000 inhabitants, 6,000 die by September, 4,000 from plague, the rest from starvation and dysentery. The survivors are skeletal, too weak to stand. William of Orange watches from outside and makes a decision that will either save Holland or destroy it. He's going to flood the countryside. The plan is this. Holland sits below sea level, protected by an intricate system of dikes that hold back the North Sea and manage drainage. If you breach those dikes in the right places, you can flood the low-lying polders, the reclaimed farmland that makes Holland rich. Flood enough area, and you can create a shallow inland sea. Then sail flat-bottomed boats carrying troops and food directly across the flooded fields to Leiden. The Spanish, positioned in forts designed for dry land, will have to retreat or drown. The problem? This destroys Holland. Those polders took centuries to reclaim from the sea. They're the most productive agricultural land in Europe. Flooding them means economic ruin for years, maybe decades. Some areas might never recover. The local farmers and landowners resist. They'd rather take their chances with Spain than lose everything they own. But William pushes through. He needs Leiden to hold. Without Leiden, the revolt collapses. He sends a carrier pigeon into the city on August 3rd with a message. Hold for 3 months. I'm coming by water. Admiral Louis de Boisseau commands the relief fleet. He's a nobleman from Brussels. Educated in Calvinist theology in Geneva, fled Alba's Inquisition in 1567, joined William's cause. He's now Admiral of Zeeland, commanding the watergarrison, the sea beggars, a mix of privateers, pirates, Dutch patriots, and hardcore Calvinists who've been raiding Spanish shipping since 1569. These aren't regular navy. They're guerrilla sailors who know every tidal channel and drainage ditch in Holland, perfect for sailing through flooded farmland. Boisseau assembles over 200 flat-bottomed vessels, small craft, shallow draft, designed to navigate Holland's canals and polders. He loads them with food, bread, herring, cheese, and embarks 2,500 veteran sailors and Marines. These men fought at the Battle of the Scheldt in January 1574, where they destroyed 15 Spanish ships trying to relieve Middelburg. They're experienced, motivated, and they know if Leiden falls, the entire rebel cause is finished. August 3rd. The outer dikes break, water starts flowing from the North Sea inland, but it's slow. The wind is blowing from the east, pushing water back toward the sea. The flooded area spreads but stays shallow. The fleet can't move yet. William himself falls ill with violent fever in mid-August. Operations stall. Inside Leiden, people are dying by the dozen daily. On August 21st, the city council sends William a message via pigeon. We held 3 months, 2 with food, 1 without. We can't hold much longer. William responds immediately, still fevered. All dikes are breached. Relief is coming. Just hold. But the water isn't rising fast enough. The flooded zone spreads across the countryside, turning fields into marshland, but it's too shallow for the boats. They need at least a foot of depth to float the fleet. Right now they have inches. September 8th. Inside Leiden, the population riots. A mob gathers outside the town hall demanding surrender. They're starving, plague-ridden, watching their children die. Mayor Peter Adriaans van der Werf faces the crowd. According to witness Jan Fruitiers, who wrote it down 3 years later, van der Werf offers his own body to the mob. If you're so hungry, kill me and eat me. But we will never surrender to Spain. The gesture works. The crowd disperses, but it's a temporary fix. The city has days, maybe a week before collapse. William recovers from his fever on September 1st. The relief operation resumes in earnest, but the geography is working against them. 15 miles separate Leiden from the nearest point where the fleet can safely gather. In between are multiple dike systems, each one a separate barrier that must be breached. The Spanish have fortified the strongest points. This isn't just about flooding, It's about navigating a maze of dikes, canals, and Spanish forts, all while praying for the right wind. September 10th, the fleet reaches the land Scheiding, a major dike barrier about 5 miles from Leiden. The Spanish have a garrison here, but they're rattled by the rising water. Boiseau launches a night attack. The Sea Beggars storm the dike, overwhelm the defenders, lose several hundred men in hand-to-hand fighting, but take the position. At dawn, they cut through the dike. Water pours through. The fleet advances. Next barrier. The Greenway Dike, less than a mile inland. The Spanish fled this position overnight, panicked by the flooding. The Sea Beggars cut it without resistance, but now the problem gets worse. As the water spreads over more and more countryside, it gets shallower. The flooded zone is expanding, but the depth is dropping. Most of the fleet runs aground. They're stuck. Inside Leiden, citizens see the grounded boats through telescopes. They think relief has failed. The calls for surrender resume. Mayor van der Werf holds the line, but barely. He's running out of arguments. Outside, Boiseau realizes he needs deeper water. The only route forward is through a canal leading to the Zotermeer, a large freshwater lake. But that canal is guarded by 3,000 Spanish troops and a fortified bridge. A direct assault would be suicide. September 18th. The wind finally shifts from east to west. Now it's blowing from the ocean inland. The water starts piling up against the dikes, rising hour by hour. The fleet floats again. Boiseau maneuvers his 200 ships around the Spanish canal defenses, uses the Zotermeer as a bypass, approaches Leiden from a different angle. The Spanish positions, designed to block roads and canals, become isolated islands as the water rises around them. By late September, the Sea Beggars are within sight of Leiden's walls. 2 Spanish forts still block the direct route, Zoterwoude and Lammen. Zoterwoude's garrison sees the fleet approaching, the water rising, and simply flees. The Dutch occupy the empty fort. Lammen is different. It's the strongest Spanish position, well above water level, heavily garrisoned, commanded by Colonel Borgia. It sits less than a mile from Leiden's walls. The Dutch admiral hesitates. A frontal assault would cost hundreds of lives. Inside Leiden, the citizens see the delay and send a carrier pigeon to Boiseau, proposing a coordinated attack at dawn, the fleet from outside, a sortie from inside the city. October 1st, the wind increases to storm force, blowing from the southwest. Heavy rain. The water rises dramatically overnight. The Spanish positions at Lammen, watching the tide climb their ramparts, realize they're about to be cut off. October 2nd, midnight. A massive crash echoes across the flooded landscape. The Spanish at Lammen hearing the noise in the darkness and seeing lights approaching across the water, believe it's the Dutch attack starting early. They panic. The entire garrison abandons the fort and retreats inland by lamplight, wading through chest-deep water. The noise wasn't an attack. It was a section of Leiden's city wall collapsing, undermined by the floodwater. The Spanish could have walked through the breach and taken the city in the last hour before relief arrived. Instead, they fled, terrified of the storm and the rising sea. October 3rd is morning. The Sea Beggars sail past the abandoned fort at Lammen and reach Leiden's walls. The citizens are so weakened by starvation that most can't stand. The fleet distributes herring and white bread. According to tradition, though the evidence is disputed, an orphan boy named Cornelis Joppensoen entered the abandoned Spanish camp at the Lammenschans fort and found a cooking pot still full of hutspot, a stew of potatoes, carrots, and onions, abandoned in the Spanish retreat. That pot is now in Museum de Lachenhal in Leiden, a symbol of the siege's end. The Spanish losses during the final flooding and retreat are recorded in multiple sources. The Beacon of Truth account from February 2021, based on contemporary Dutch chronicles, states approximately 1,500 Spanish soldiers died in the October 1st to 3rd retreat. Some drowned trying to escape the rising flood, others killed by Sea Beggar Marines pursuing them across the dikes, the rest dying from exposure in the storm. The military wiki fandom entry on the siege, drawing from Spanish military records, confirms several hundred Spanish casualties during the September 10th land Scheiding assault, with additional hundreds lost at various fortified positions as the water rose and cut off retreat routes. But the real destruction wasn't measured in body count. It was measured in strategic collapse. The Spanish had committed months to this siege, built 62 forts, maintained thousands of troops, and lost it all in 72 hours because the Dutch turned geography into a weapon. Francisco de Valdez, the Spanish commander, reported to his superiors that continuing the siege was impossible. The troops were demoralized, scattered, many drowned or killed. The fortifications were underwater. Resupply was impossible with the entire region flooded. He recommended withdrawal. Spain agreed. The flooding devastated Holland. Estimates suggest roughly half the county's agricultural land was underwater by early October 1574. It took years to drain. Some areas were never fully reclaimed. The economic cost ran into millions of guilders, equivalent to hundreds of millions in modern currency. But it worked. Leiden survived. The Dutch revolt survived, and Spain learned that conventional siege warfare doesn't work when your enemy can weaponize the ocean. If you value documented military history and tactical innovation like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Also, this script is researched and factual. Using sources from the Battle of the Scheldt-Kittel Encyclopedia article, updated June 6, 2025, citing Spanish casualty figures, Dagmar de Groot's environmental history research on the Little Ice Age climate during the siege published in Georgetown University Studies, and Robert Teague's detailed analysis of military inundations in the Dutch Revolt available through Niche Canada Environmental History Network published April 13, 2017, which documents flooding extent and duration. Now back to the information. William of Orange rewarded Leiden in 1575 by founding Leiden University, the first university in the Netherlands. The charter was issued in the King of Spain's name, ironic since William was in open rebellion against Philip, but it was clearly recognition for the city's sacrifice. The university still exists today, one of Europe's leading research institutions. The city celebrates October 3rd every year as a public holiday. It's called Leiden's Onset, Leiden's Relief. The municipality distributes free herring and white bread to citizens. Families eat hutspot stew in memory of the abandoned Spanish cooking pot. There's a street fair, open-air concerts, and the largest public celebration in the Netherlands, with over 200,000 attendees annually. The tradition started in 1575, continued through 4 centuries, and remains unbroken. But the siege had long-term military consequences beyond Leiden itself. The Spanish treasury went dry in 1575. The troops hadn't been paid for months. They mutinied, rampaging through the Netherlands in what became known as the Spanish Fury, sacking cities loyal to Spain, killing thousands, destroying what little goodwill remained. The entire Netherlands rebelled. Even cities that had stayed neutral or sided with Spain turned against the crown. The northern provinces eventually formed the United Provinces, the independent Dutch republic that would dominate trade and finance in the 17th century. The flooding tactic became a Dutch standard. Between 1572 and 1576, nearly every major Dutch victory involved military inundation. Alkmaar in 1573 was relieved the same way Leiden would be a year later, cut the dikes, flood the countryside, forced the Spanish to retreat. The Dutch developed sophisticated hydraulic intelligence, maps showing which polders could be flooded with which dikes breached, calculations for how much water flow was needed, predictions for how wind direction would affect flooding speed. It was warfare by engineering. The Spanish tried to counter it. Alba commissioned a survey in the early 1570s mapping how Holland could be permanently flooded by cutting sea dikes in the right places. The idea was to threaten the Dutch with total destruction. Surrender, or we drown your entire province. But the plan was never executed. Even Spanish hardliners realized that destroying Holland's economic infrastructure would make the conquest pointless. They needed Holland's wealth, not a worthless swamp. The tactic influenced later Dutch military planning. The Dutch water line, constructed starting in the 1640s and expanded through the 19th century, was a permanent defensive system based on controlled flooding. It ran from the Zuiderzee in the north to the River Wal in the south, protecting the core Dutch heartland, including Utrecht and Amsterdam. Sluices and fortified positions were built to allow rapid flooding to a specific depth, just deep enough to stop troops and cavalry, but too shallow for boats. The system was used successfully against French invasion in 1672 and remained part of Dutch defense planning into World War II. But there's a deeper story here about climate. The Leiden siege happened during the Grindelwald fluctuation, one of the coldest periods of the Little Ice Age that affected Europe from the 16th through 19th centuries. Environmental historian Dagmar de Groot at Georgetown University, in research published through Climate Reconstruction Studies, notes that the siege coincided with unusually stormy and rainy conditions in the North Sea region. The October 1st storm that finally raised the water high enough for the sea beggars to break through wasn't just lucky. It was part of a broader pattern of severe weather that characterized the 1570s. The Little Ice Age made Holland's climate harsher, but also more weaponizable. The wet conditions meant higher water tables, faster flooding when dikes were breached, and more severe storms that could drive seawater inland. The same climate that made agriculture more difficult made defensive flooding more effective. William of Orange and his advisors understood this. They were working with nature, not against it. The Spanish, coming from the warmer Mediterranean and used to siege warfare in dry climates, underestimated how quickly water could dominate a battlefield in the Low Countries. The social dynamics inside Leiden during the siege reveal how populations behave under extreme stress. The plague that killed 4,000 people in August and September 1574 was pneumonic plague, spread through respiratory droplets in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Survivors described bodies left in the streets because there weren't enough healthy people to bury them. The September 8th riot, where Mayor van der Werf offered himself to the mob, wasn't an isolated incident. There were multiple near surrenders. Moments when the city council almost opened the gates. What held Leiden together was collective memory of Spanish atrocities. Zutphen, Naarden, Haarlem, every besieged city that surrendered saw massacres. The Spanish policy of exemplary violence backfired. Instead of terrorizing cities into submission, it convinced them to resist to the death because surrender meant death anyway. Van der Werf's rhetoric worked not because it was inspiring, but because it was true. The citizens knew exactly what would happen if they opened the gates. The carrier pigeon communication between William of Orange and Leiden is documented in multiple contemporary sources. William sent pigeons into the city multiple times. August 3rd, promising relief in 3 months. August 21st, acknowledging their suffering but urging them to hold. Early September with updates on flooding progress. The city sent pigeons out. August 21st, reporting they'd fulfilled the 3-month promise and couldn't continue. September 26th, when church organist Willem Cornelis Spielman sent out 8 pigeons he'd kept alive during the famine to reach Admiral Boisot's fleet. 2 returned on September 28th and 29th, with messages from Boisot saying relief was imminent. The letters were read publicly in Leiden. Church bells rang. It kept the population from surrendering for the final critical days. The sea beggars who sailed the relief fleet were a mix of professional sailors and ideological zealots. They wore Gusen medals, propaganda badges with slogans like "Liever Turks dan Paps," meaning rather Turkish than papist. Some had fought as pirates against Spanish shipping for years. Others were refugees from Spanish-controlled territories. They answered to no formal chain of command beyond William of Orange. They were privateers operating under letters of marque Cars, which made them legal combatants under international law. Barely. The Spanish considered them pirates and executed captured sea beggars without trial. This made them fight harder. No quarter expected, none given. Admiral Louis de Boisot lost an eye during the January 1574 Battle of the Scheldt, when his fleet destroyed 15 Spanish ships attempting to relieve Middelburg. He fought the entire Leiden relief operation half-blind, navigating flooded terrain at night with limited depth perception. He survived the siege and continued commanding sea beggar fleets until his death in 1576. His descendants became prominent Dutch naval officers for generations. The flat-bottomed boats that carried the relief fleet were called schuiten in Dutch, shallow-draft cargo vessels originally designed for canal transport. They drew less than 3 feet when loaded, which meant they could float in flooded polders where normal ships would ground. The sea beggars requisitioned over 200 of these vessels, mounted small cannon on some, loaded others with food and ammunition. It was an improvised navy sailing across improvised sea, fighting an improvised naval battle in what should have been farmland. The Spanish fortifications ringing Leiden in 62 positions included redoubts, sconces, and entrenchments. Most were built to interdict roads and canals, standard siege architecture. What they didn't account for was the roads and canals disappearing underwater. When the flooding came, each fort became an isolated island. Resupply was impossible. Communication broke down. The Spanish troops, watching water rise around their positions, had to choose stay and potentially drown, or retreat through floodwater toward Spanish-held territory miles away. Most chose retreat. Those who delayed too long drowned or were captured by sea beggar raiding parties. The military engineering that made the flooding possible was sophisticated. Dutch hydraulic experts, working with William of Orange's staff, calculated which dikes to breach and what order to maximize flooding speed and coverage. They identified 4 primary breach points around Leiden, each chosen to direct water flow toward the city from different angles. The Groenendijk, one of the breach sites, now marked by a monument, was a critical juncture where cutting the dike allowed seawater to flood inland via existing drainage channels. The engineering challenge wasn't just breaching dikes, but managing their resulting flood to avoid drowning Leiden itself while maximizing pressure on Spanish positions. The Little Ice Age climate during the siege meant that autumn 1574 brought early cold, heavy rains, and fierce storms. The October 1st storm that broke the siege involved sustained winds from the southwest strong enough to drive seawater inland against the natural drainage gradient. Contemporary Dutch sources describe the storm as providential, God's wind saving his chosen people. Modern climate analysis suggests it was an unusually intense low-pressure system, typical of the Grindelwald fluctuation period, when North Sea storm frequency and intensity increased markedly. The economic cost of the flooding was staggering but calculable. Robert Teague's research on military inundations during the Dutch Revolt, published through the Canadian Journal of Netherlandic Studies in 2014, documents that roughly 50% of Holland's agricultural land was underwater by October 1574. Drainage and land reclamation took until the early 1580s in some areas. Total economic damage likely exceeded 5 million guilders, equivalent to several years of Holland's total economic output. The Dutch traded short-term prosperity for long-term survival. It worked, but it wasn't cheap. The Spanish perspective on the siege reveals organizational dysfunction. Francisco de Valdez repeatedly reported to the Duke of Alba and later to Luis de Requesens that he lacked sufficient troops and siege artillery to force Leiden's surrender by direct assault. His requests for reinforcement were denied. Spain's military was overstretched across multiple theaters: Mediterranean campaigns against the Ottomans, suppressing rebellion in Granada, maintaining forces in Italy and the Americas. The Netherlands was supposed to be a quick police action. 3 years in, with massive costs and no clear victory, Spanish commanders were realizing they'd underestimated the Dutch. The Alba's brutal pacification strategy failed because it united opposition. By massacring populations in Zutphen, Naarden, and Haarlem, Spain convinced every Dutch city that resistance was the only option. Alba resigned in December 1573, citing ill health, but the real reason was strategic failure. His successor, Luis de Requesens, adopted a more conciliatory approach, offering amnesty, negotiating with rebel provinces, trying to divide the opposition. It didn't work either. The Leiden siege under Requesens, command failed despite his efforts at moderation. The Dutch revolt had become a national movement. The Leiden relief had immediate strategic effects. The Spanish army's morale collapsed. Troops who survived the flooding retreat spread stories about sailing Dutch boats and drowning comrades. Desertion rates spiked. The November 1575 Spanish treasury bankruptcy meant troops weren't paid for months. Mutinies broke out across the Spanish-controlled Netherlands. The Spanish Fury, bands of unpaid Spanish soldiers sacking cities indiscriminately, alienated even loyalist populations. The southern provinces, which had stayed neutral or supported Spain, turned rebel. The pacification of Ghent in November 1576 brought Catholic and Protestant provinces together in united opposition to Spanish rule. The long-term impact on Dutch identity was profound. Leiden's relief became a founding myth of Dutch nationhood, proof that courage, ingenuity, and willingness to sacrifice could defeat a superpower. The October 3rd celebration started immediately in 1575 and never stopped. Through 4 centuries of Dutch history, Spanish occupation, French invasion, German occupation, Leiden has celebrated October 3rd. It's not a government holiday. It's a civic tradition maintained by the citizens themselves, passed down through generations. The University William of Orange, founded in Leiden in 1575, became one of Europe's intellectual centers. Leiden University trained Dutch ministers, lawyers, scientists, and politicians for centuries. It was where René Descartes studied, where Rembrandt briefly enrolled before becoming a painter, where Hugo Grotius developed international law theory. The connection between the siege and the university is direct. Leiden earned the university by refusing to surrender. The city traded starvation and plague for intellectual prestige that lasted 400 years. The military lessons from Leiden influenced European warfare for generations. Defensive flooding became a recognized tactic. The French attempted it during the 30 Years' War. The Russians used it against Napoleon in 1812, the modern understanding of unconventional warfare, using terrain, climate, and infrastructure as weapons, has roots in Dutch practice during the 80 Years' War. The idea that a weaker force can defeat a stronger one by changing the battlefield itself, rather than fighting conventionally, came directly from successes like Leiden. The Spanish never adapted. They kept trying to impose conventional siege warfare in Holland and kept failing. The Siege of Ostend from 1601 to 1604 lasted 3 years and cost both sides enormous casualties, but ended inconclusively. The Spanish finally recognized Dutch independence in the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, 80 years after the revolt started. They never conquered Holland. The same tercios that dominated European battlefields couldn't crack a network of dikes, polders, and citizen militias willing to drown their own country rather than submit. Here's the late reveal that reframes everything. In 2011, Dutch photographer Erwin Olaf created a series called Liberty, reinterpreting the Leiden siege through modern historical analysis. Recent scholarship questions the traditional narrative. Did the orphan Cornelis Joppensoen really find the Hutspot pot? Or is that legend created later to give the relief a tangible symbol? Did van der Werf actually offer his body to the mob? Or did witness John Froitiers embellish the story 3 years after the fact? Modern research shows plague killed far more Leiden citizens than starvation, but Dutch cultural memory emphasizes hunger because it fits the narrative of Spanish cruelty. What's not disputed, the flooding happened. The sea beggars sailed through farmland, the Spanish retreated, and Leiden survived. The casualty numbers are contested, but multiple independent sources confirm over 1,000 Spanish deaths during the final retreat. The strategic consequences, Dutch revolt continuing, Spanish treasury bankruptcy, ultimate Dutch independence are historical fact. The myth-making around the siege reveals how societies construct founding narratives from traumatic events, emphasizing certain details, downplaying others, creating heroes and symbols that serve collective identity. The soil core samples from the flooded polders around Leiden, analyzed in recent decades, show sedimentation layers marking the 1574 flood. The saline intrusion from seawater flooding killed freshwater ecosystems, deposited marine sediments inland, and altered soil chemistry for years. Drainage wasn't just pumping water out, it required flushing the salt, restoring soil biology, rebuilding the entire agricultural infrastructure. Some areas never recovered their previous productivity. The environmental cost of the Leiden relief was permanent. The Groningen-Dike monument, erected at one of the 4 primary dike breach sites, marks where Dutch engineers cut through to flood the approach to Leiden. It's a simple stone marker in a field that's now farmland again. Reclaimed from the sea centuries ago, most tourists visiting Leiden never see it, but it sits on ground that was underwater in October 1574, when 2,500 sea beggars sailed boats across this exact spot to save a starving city. Water doesn't ask permission. It finds the low places and fills them. The Dutch knew this, the Spanish learned it. 1574 proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the army you build, but the landscape you're willing to destroy. Leiden held because Holland drowned. The revolt survived because the people chose temporary ruin over permanent submission. 6,000 dead from plague, half the province underwater. Years of economic devastation. And in the end, independence. The Spanish fled by lamplight. The walls fell the same night. Relief came at dawn with herring and bread.